For years, she toiled away, unseen by the world. But in just a few words, JD Vance did something that shattered her composure right there, in the middle of the diner. Tanya had long understood that exhaustion wasn't just about aching muscles. It settled deep in your bones, where even sleep couldn't reach. She was always tired, the kind of tired that made the world feel heavier with each passing morning. Before dawn had a chance to stretch across the sky, she was already up, ensuring her teenage son had everything he needed before heading to Mason's Diner, a place steeped in the scent of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and faded dreams. She had spent years there, watching faces come and go while her own life remained unchanged. There was nothing glamorous about the job. The uniform was stiff and uncomfortable, the long hours wore her down, and the customers barely acknowledged her. Some were kind, but most treated her like part of the furniture, no more significant than the napkin dispenser or the salt shaker. She tried not to let it get to her. The way people called her Miss, without a glance, the way some looked right through her, as if she weren't a person with bills to pay, a son to raise, and a heart burdened by too much. But the worst were the ones who barely noticed her at all. Like the businessman glued to his phone, ordering without a single look up, then leaving behind a mess big enough for 2 trips. Or the couple whispering about the service while she was still clearing their plates. Or the teenager who snickered with his friends when she dropped a fork, muttering, "Bet she's been here forever." They weren't wrong. It felt like forever. But leaving wasn't an option. She had a son, a boy who still dared to dream, and she was determined to shield him from the kind of exhaustion that turned hope into a luxury. Rent was due. Groceries didn't buy themselves. If working double shifts meant keeping a roof over their heads, then she would keep showing up. That's what mothers did. Checking the time, 1:30. The lunch rush was fading, giving her a brief moment to catch her breath before dinner. She wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed the lukewarm coffee pot, and scanned the diner. That's when she noticed him. A man sat alone at table 9, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap. There was something familiar about him, but Tanya didn't have time to dwell on it. A customer was a customer. She put on her best "I'm here to help" smile, grabbed a menu, and approached. Yet something about him gave her pause. He wasn't like the regulars who kept the same routine or the travelers who rushed through. There was a weight in his posture, a quiet in his eyes. Still, she had a job to do. She placed the menu down gently and said, "Afternoon." "Coffee?" she asked, already tilting the pot. Then he looked up, and for a moment, something shifted. Recognition. Maybe. But from where? "Yeah, thanks," he said. His voice was even, polite, but restrained, like someone used to measuring his words. Tanya poured the coffee, waiting for him to glance at the menu, but he didn't. Instead, he stared into his cup, as if the steam carried some unspoken thought he wasn't ready to share. "You need a few minutes?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nah, I'll take the meatloaf mashed. Potatoes, no gravy. Green beans, if they're fresh." "They're canned," Tanya admitted. A small, almost imperceptible smile. "Figured. That's fine." She scribbled the order down, resisting the odd urge to fill the silence. It wasn't her place. As she walked back to the counter, something nagged at her. Where had she seen that face before? The thought barely settled before the door swung open. Earl. Loud. Obnoxious. One of the regulars she could do without. He never tipped and always had something to say about the state of the country, things that made Tanya clench her jaw. Sure enough, he stomped in, making a beeline for the counter. "You see who that is?" he muttered, jerking his chin toward table 9. Tanya frowned, pretending to wipe a spot on the counter. "Should I?" Earl leaned in like he was sharing a secret. "That's JD Vance. The politician. Wrote that book about growing up poor, you know. The one they turned into a movie." Tanya's grip on the rag tightened. She'd heard of him, sure, but she hadn't realized it was him. She glanced back at table 9. JD Vance sat quietly, drinking his coffee, looking at nothing in particular. She didn't know much about him beyond the headlines, and truth be told, she didn't care. Politicians came and went. Promises were made, broken, forgotten. People like her? They kept working. Still, something about the moment made her stomach twist. Earl snorted. Bet he won't tip. Probably thinks he's too important. Tanya ignored him. She had a meal to serve. She picked up JD Vance's plate from the pass and carried it to his table, the scent of meatloaf and mashed potatoes rising with the steam. She set it down. "Enjoy," she said, her voice steady, professional. He glanced up, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment, then gave a small, absent nod before cutting into the meatloaf with slow, deliberate movements. Tanya had seen this before, someone eating in silence, lost in thought. It wasn't her job to wonder what weighed on a person's mind. She had tables to wipe, coffee to pour, 100 tiny tasks to keep her moving so she wouldn't dwell on things that had no place in her life. JD ate without rush. He didn't check his phone. Didn't glance around impatiently like the customers who couldn't wait to pay and leave. He just ate methodically, like a man used to quiet meals. By the time he finished, the diner had emptied out. Earl had long since left, leaving behind the faint scent of cheap aftershave and a few greasy dollar bills that barely counted as a tip. Tanya was clearing a nearby table when she heard the soft scrape of a chair against the floor. JD Vance stood, reached into his pocket, and placed a folded check under the edge of his empty plate. He didn't linger. No questions. No final words. He just left. The goodbye was quiet, just the soft jingle of the diner door swinging shut. Tanya sighed, grabbing a rag as she made her way to table 9. Her mind was already moving to the next task, probably refilling the sugar caddies, when she reached for the plate. That's when she saw it. The check. She picked it up, expecting the usual, a standard tip, maybe nothing at all. People left behind all sorts of things. Loose change. A scribbled thanks that never felt like much. But as she unfolded the paper, her hands went still. It wasn't just a tip. It was a message. For your kindness. For your patience. For the things you've endured that you shouldn't have had to. I see you. I honor you. Thank you for everything you do. Her breath hitched. She swallowed hard, blinking fast as her vision blurred. Then she saw the number beside the note. It wasn't 20. It wasn't 50. It was enough to pay her rent. Enough to breathe, for the first time in what felt like years. She gripped the check, knuckles white. Her knees wobbled. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she wasn't the kind of woman who cried at work. Not where people could see. But standing there alone in a nearly empty diner, she couldn't stop them. She wasn't crying over the money. Not just the money. It was the words. Because when was the last time someone had really looked at her? Acknowledged everything she carried? She had spent years working, serving, giving, and yet, so often, she felt invisible. But today, she wasn't. And she would never forget this moment. Tanya stood frozen, the check trembling in her hands, the words echoing in her chest. For the things you've endured that you shouldn't have had to. Her breath came unsteady. She wasn't the kind of woman who dwelled on things life didn't give her that luxury. Bills didn't wait for grief. Work didn't care if you had scars. But those words felt like a hand reaching into the past, pulling up memories she had spent years trying to bury. Long nights at the kitchen table, past due notices stacked beside an empty checkbook. Her son, barely 6, tugging at her sleeve, whispering, "Mama, can we have the lights back on soon?" After the power had been cut for the second time that year. The job before this one, where she worked twice as hard, only to watch younger, less experienced girls get promoted while she was told to be patient. She had swallowed so much over the years. The exhaustion. The unfairness. The moments when she wanted to scream but didn't, because she had a son to think about. So she smiled through the disrespect. Kept serving. Kept pushing through. Kept pretending it didn't sting when customers treated her like she was less than them. And no one had ever noticed. Until now. She wiped her cheek quickly, then, with careful hands, folded the check and tucked it away. That night, she went to Miss Dottie's store, the tiny grocery where she always shopped when money was tight. Dottie had a soft spot for struggling mothers. She'd let Tanya buy on credit when times were tough, never once making her feel ashamed for it. Tonight, though, Tanya wasn't here to ask for favors. She walked straight to the essentials: milk, eggs, bread, then hesitated. Fresh fruit, a pack of her son's favorite granola bars, and on impulse, a chocolate cake from the bakery section, something just for them. At the register, Miss Dottie peered over her glasses, her wrinkled hands moving steadily as she rang everything up. "Bit more than usual today," she remarked. Tanya just smiled and pulled out the check. "Not a problem tonight." Miss Dottie looked at the paper, then at Tanya, and her face softened. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need to. Instead, she just bagged the groceries and said, "Good for you, honey." As Tanya loaded the bags into her car, she spotted a woman sitting on the curb outside, a little girl curled up beside her. The woman's arms were wrapped around the child, rocking her slightly, her eyes carrying a tiredness Tanya knew all too well. She hesitated. She could drive away. Pretend she didn't see them. Tell herself someone else would help. But she knew the truth: most people didn't stop. Most people looked right past women like them, as if they were just part of the scenery, as if they weren't mothers fighting to keep their children safe. Tanya grabbed one of the grocery bags, walked over, and gently set it down beside the woman. "Here," she said softly. "Some food for you and your little one." The woman looked up, startled. For a moment, Tanya thought she might refuse. But then, slowly, her face crumpled, her lips pressing together as she reached for the bag. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tanya nodded. "We gotta take care of each other, right?" The woman gave a shaky nod, holding the bag close like it was something precious. Tanya didn't linger. She didn't need to. Some gestures didn't require explanations. Some moments spoke for themselves. As she walked back to her car, she felt something settle in her chest, not just relief, but a quiet certainty. She couldn't change everything. The world would keep spinning, unfair as ever. The long hours, the exhaustion, the weight of making ends meet, they'd still be there tomorrow. But so would this. This reminder that kindness mattered. That being seen, truly seen, had the power to shift something deep inside a person. JD Vance had seen her, and tonight, she had seen someone else. Tanya took a deep breath, turned the key in the ignition, and drove home.